during the lunch break at work. After eating lunch with my colleagues, I was reading a comic book at my own desk. Even when the bell rang to let us know the end of the lunch break, I was engrossed in the story, wanting to read just one more page. Then, somebody tapped me on the shoulder from behind. When I turned around, it was my direct superior, the department head. In a hurry, I opened the drawer and threw in the comic book. "Hey Johnson, you got a moment? Could you come to the conference room with me?" The department head spoke to me in the same mild and gentle tone as always. Immediately, I got up from my seat and followed the department head to the conference room. When we entered the empty conference room, the department head asked me if I wasn't going to take any more paid leaves. In the previous month, I sporadically took day offs almost every week. "What about it, Johnson? Are you going to take some day offs this month, or not?" Saying that, the department head gave me a sharp stare. As I was lost for words to reply, the department head spoke ruthlessly. "You don't want to work with me, do you? As you wished. You're going to be let go from my department and also from the head office." The department head told me that this was a transfer order. I had no right to refuse, and I was forced to either follow the transfer order or quit the company. "So you mean I'm being demoted?" That night, when I got home, I told my girlfriend Mary about the situation. I'd been living with her for almost 7 years. I was forced by the department head to choose between following the transfer order or quitting the company, and I chose to stay in the company. The place I was being transferred to was a sales office in a remote area in the Midwest. Mary asked me why I was being demoted. When I hesitated to answer, Mary said, "Could it be that you were trying to change jobs and the company found out?" She hit the nail on the head. With a stunned face, Mary sighed. She said that she had a vague idea on the reason why I was taking day offs during the week and going somewhere. "I have already changed jobs 4 times since I graduated from college. It's not that I have any particular complaints about any of the companies I've worked for. However, once I've been in a job for 3 or 4 years and get used to it, I get bored. Not that I have any ambition either. I just felt like maybe it's about time I tried something different." However, there was another reason why I decided to attempt this 5th job change. I'm already 40. I was thinking of settling down at my next job. And once that job gets secured, I was thinking of going to the next step with my relationship with Mary. So, I consulted with a headhunting agent and managed to get interviews with several companies, but my age was a barrier to get a new job somehow. I was considering giving up on changing jobs. And then came the demotion. I never thought that my job hunting would be found out by the department head. I can understand why your boss got pissed off. His trusted subordinate was secretly trying to change jobs behind his back. I had nothing to say to Mary's words. "So anyway, I'm being transferred, right? So, when I tried to ask her to come with me, Mary cut me off sharply. I have my life here, building my career. Besides, I'm not obliged to follow you to such a remote place. We're not even married." After that, Mary and I got into a heated argument. Being at a disadvantage, I pouted like a spoiled child and took a nap on the living room couch. Then, I began to reflect on my relationship with Mary since I met her. I first met Mary at a friend's wedding reception. She wasn't exceptionally pretty, but there was something welcoming about her face that drew me to her. She asked me about my job. I told her I had switched jobs twice and proudly said, "Staying at one company for too long is outdated." She nodded approvingly and said, "Johnson, you're very career-oriented, aren't you?" She was the one who suggested exchanging numbers. She was also the one who planned our dates for the most part. We became a couple within 6 months. And soon after, we started living together. You know how young couples are constantly giggling together over nothing. That's how we were. We never stopped laughing when we were together. Everything we did was fun. We really need to clean this dusty floor. True, but I can't be bothered today. We laughed our heads off, simply at the thought of skipping cleaning of our apartment over the weekend. Fast forward to about 4 years from those happy days. When I started looking for another job, Mary, upon finding out, questioned my decision. Things at work were going smoothly, and I was well compensated. I didn't have any issues with my coworkers either. Despite all this, she asked me why I was considering changing jobs. Well, because there's a company out there, you know. I jokingly replied, but she didn't laugh. It was clear that she started to doubt my true nature. She realized that my attitude towards work was not about career progression, but simply about being fickle. From then on, her look at me changed. Not just about work, but also about our relationship. Despite living together for so long, I never brought up the topic of marriage, and this seemed to trigger distrust in her. Fast forward another 3 years. We stopped laughing together and stopped doing things together. We felt there was no reason to live together anymore, but we also didn't have a reason to break up either. Amid this uneventful life, I suddenly received the notice of my transfer. I don't expect her to follow me to such a remote place. We're not even married. The idea of resettling the job and the relationship with Mary upon turning 40 was just my own selfish, wishful thinking. The new place of assignment was in rural Montana, way out in the sticks. The office was a rickety old single-story building that seemed to be decades old. 5 male employees of different ages and a 40-year-old woman named Susan, who was the director, worked there. While all the male employees seemed dull, she was different. With her clear-cut facial features and short hairstyle, along with her brisk way of talking and carrying herself, she was the epitome of a successful career woman. I couldn't help but wonder why such a woman was managing a remote office like this one. So, what did you do to deserve this? In a partitioned-off, makeshift reception area, I was summoned by the director Susan and started our conversation like so. I was at a loss for a response. Then, she informed me that unless I stirred up some sort of trouble, I wouldn't have been assigned to this sales office. She said, "If you don't want to talk about it, I won't push you," and changed the subject. She explained that the primary task in the sales office is customer follow-up. Also, our assigned region is surprisingly big, so there would be a need to get around using a company car. She asked me if I had any questions. Well, my company found out that I'd been looking for other jobs. I stuttered, oddly answering her initial question. Something about Susan made me want to share everything. It felt like a magic. Then, she opened my work history document that she had requested from the corporate HR department. "So, you've switched jobs a few times before joining our company, huh?" "Yes, I tend to want to change my workplace when I get accustomed to the job," I replied, and found myself repeatedly bowing to her subconsciously. "I see. I have a proposal for you, Restless Johnson. Will you be open to it?" I found her bluntness rather refreshing. She then revealed her plan. Ever since her partner became the director, they had been hoping to improve the performance of this sales office by actively acquiring new customers. However, they lacked the right talent to achieve it. "Would you like to give it a try? Consider it like switching jobs," she suggested. Her gaze held an undeniable intensity. "I'll do it. I have no other choice," I thought. Even if it's a small sales office, if I could contribute to increasing the performance, I might be able to return to the headquarters. That's how my life at the new office began. Though I was expecting nothing out of it, it was surprisingly rewarding and made me hopeful for what we could accomplish. Every weekend, I would visit the apartment where Mary still lived by herself. There, too, things started to change. I was eager for Mary to hear about my week at the new office. I would start trembling. At first, she showed me no interests, but slowly, she began to pay attention to what I was saying. "It seems like you're actually happy about the transfer. You're weird." "It's not a transfer, it's a job switch, a new job." I said it laughing. Mary joined in, calling me a fool. We both burst out laughing. My sales rounds gradually gained momentum, and the number of new clients also steadily increased. The sales office's performance was on an upward trend. Susan was also pleased, and we started to spend more time after work having drinks at the only pub near the office. The sales office, Director Susan, and we all enjoyed a smooth sailing period. However, on a Friday half a year later, Director Susan, who had been out at the headquarters all day, returned to the sales office in the evening. Unlike her usual brisk self, she looked as if she had lost her soul. I rushed over to her immediately. "It's all over, everything," Susan muttered to me, then straightened her back and announced the news to everyone. The sales office would be closed at the end of the next fiscal year. She asked everyone to start considering their next moves as soon as they received their dismissal notices, as there would be nothing she could do about personnel matters at that point. As she slumped into her chair, she looked at me. "They're banning new sales activity too. If we keep adding customers, it's gonna be a hassle later on." Susan had said just that before she buried her face in her hands and slumped over the desk. The closure of our branch and the order to halt all new businesses were a shock to me also. What am I supposed to do from now on? I really wanted to hop on a train and talk about the situation with Mary immediately. However, as I was getting ready to leave, Susan talked to me. "Johnson, would you join me for a drink tonight?" Seeing the look on her face, I decided to postpone going home to Mary until the next morning and join the director for the night. No, I actually wanted to join her. Because Susan and I had been after the same goal together for over half a year since my demotion. In a literal sense, we were comrades in arms. She and I had quite a few drinks at our usual and only pub. "All the hard work you've put in. We managed to boost our performance, and yet they're pulling out, shutting down our branch," she grumbled, drinking heavily until she could hardly stand. What happened next? The following morning, as I started to tell the story, Mary leaned in, eager to hear more. I told her about escorting a thoroughly intoxicated Susan to her partner's house, which was about a 10-minute walk from the pub. There was a light on in Susan's house. I hadn't asked anything about her personal life until then, so I didn't even know if she was single or married. "So, she's living with her family." I more or less carried Susan to the front door and rang the doorbell. A woman's voice from inside the house answered yes, and the front door opened. "Susan, get a hold of yourself." The woman took hold of the drunk Susan, chiding her. Susan kept repeating, "It's frustrating, so frustrating," under her breath. "Who's that woman?" Mary asked, looking puzzled. "Susan's partner," I replied. "Partner?" I nodded slowly and went on to describe the conversation afterwards between Susan and the woman. Susan clung to the woman in a childish and clingy manner that she'd never displayed at work. The woman gave me a wry smile, saying, "Here we go again," before she took Susan inside, then came back to where I was standing at the entrance. "Johnson, isn't it? Susan is always in your debt." She thanked me sincerely. Susan was sent to that branch because the company took issue with her living with someone who wasn't a spouse or recognized family member, I told Mary. Ever since, Susan had been living in a house they rented themselves, without receiving rent allowances from the company. Monday of the following week. As soon as I arrived at the office, Susan called me over to the reception area. The first thing she did was to apologize for her behavior on Friday, saying she had gotten so drunk she can't remember anything. I must have caused you trouble by having you take me home, and about what's going to happen from now on, Susan began, lowering her voice. She had decided to resign voluntarily, without waiting for the company's formal notice. When she was reassigned to this sales office, she was headhunted by a client company, she said. At that time, she decided to stay with the company that had demoted her without any wrongdoing, hoping to give them a taste of their own medicine. She wasn't sure if that client would still hire her, but she had several other prospects, so she was planning to look for a job after leaving. You know, my roommate suggested it might be better that way. And the roommate, Susan's partner, kindly suggested that Susan should lend a hand in my search for a new job if necessary. In other words, as long as I'm the director, I should be able to pull some strings. So why not use your paid vacation or whatever to help look for a new job? What do you think? Director Susan's words made me realize something. Since I was reassigned, I had sealed off the idea of changing jobs. That's why, no matter what order was handed down, I had decided to stay with this company. But the passive attitude would not do any good at this point. Now is the time to change jobs. But I was worried about what Mary would say if she found out I was changing jobs. That was my only concern. I contacted the headhunting agent again and started to look for a job. Thanks to Susan, the process of scheduling job interviews went smoothly. However, I couldn't find a company that would hire me. A month passed and it was time for the boss to leave the office. I wonder if I've meddled in your situation too much. Susan said when I told her that I was having a hard time finding a new job. At that time, I still had the option to stay with the company. On the weekend, I went to Mary's apartment as usual. Oh, I see, your boss Susan left the company, Mary said. And then she asked me what I was going to do. When I made a nervous face, she smiled and said, "You were looking for a new job, right?" Over the past month, when I came here for interviews, I had lied and said I was called into the headquarters, but Mary had seen right through it. I told her about how Susan was supporting my job hunting. With Susan gone, what are you going to do with your job search? To be honest, I'm not sure, I replied. I haven't found any prospective options, so I might end up sticking with my current company until retirement. You mentioned it before, right? When we first met, that the concept of a long employment at one company is outdated, Mary said, resting her hand on my shoulder. She then spoke. She disliked the idea of changing jobs out of boredom, but would agree 100% if the purpose was to find what I want to do. Don't you want to find a new job? I nodded, albeit reluctantly. But I hadn't made my mind yet. Then, Mary took out our joint bank statement from a drawer and showed it to me. With this much in savings, we can get by with just her income for a while. Leave it to me, so please, take your time and find your next job. Inspired by her words, I resigned from the company, put all my effort into job hunting, and finally secured a job at my desired company. That weekend, Mary and I went out to the city to buy a new suit for me. By chance, we ran into Susan. She was with that woman. We stood there, catching up on what had been going on in our lives. "And how about you?" Susan asked, stepping back and looking at Mary behind me. I took Mary's arm, led her forward. She's my partner." Mary gave a nervous nod. "Oh, your wife is so beautiful and lovely. Truly, you make a wonderful couple." Susan and her companion agreed. I put my arm around Mary's shoulder and said yes, looking at her. Mary was caressing her shiny wedding ring on her left hand's ring finger with her right hand. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Your subscription and likes give us the motivation to continue our work. We are looking forward to your comments as well. We'll see you in our next video. 2 years into our marriage, yet I still considered us newlyweds. 2 years since the day we vowed to spend forever together. My heart sank at the sight of my wife, unashamedly declaring, "I'm pregnant." The father was my boss. "We should wait to have kids. I want to enjoy our time as newlyweds." Those words from my wife when we got married echoed in my mind. My name is Ryan Kitchener. I turned 30 this year. I married my wife Susan 2 years ago. We met at work. We were in different departments, but worked for the same company. Every time we crossed paths in the hallways of our office building or in the elevator, I thought to myself, what a beautiful woman she was. When a coworker introduced us, I was so thrilled my heart did a little victory dance. I was always looking for an opportunity to talk to Susan, and I wasn't going to let this chance slip by. I watched every movie and read every book she recommended. My attempts to close the distance between us, slowly but surely, started to bear fruit. Back then, it seemed Susan had a boyfriend. But I didn't ask too much about him. I was indicating that it didn't matter to me. Even now, I'm amazed at my own tenacious efforts. Susan quit her job by her own volition and is now a stay-at-home wife. I'm happy that she's keeping our home safe. Susan goes to cooking and flower arrangement classes, has leisurely lunches with her friends, and lives a comfortable and relaxed life. 2 years into our marriage, around the time when our parents started hinting about wanting to have grandchildren, an unbelievable incident occurred. The busy season of overtime was over, and I was in high spirits leaving work on time. Thinking that Susan must have been feeling lonely due to my busy schedule, I bought her favorite cake on my way home. For the upcoming long weekend, we could go on a mini vacation. I picked up brochures of nearby tourist spots at a travel agency by the train station. I ordered takeout so Susan wouldn't have to worry about making dinner. I'm home. I managed to get off work early today. As I spoke to Susan while taking off my shoes at the front door, she came running from down the hall. She seemed surprised at my early return. As I explained about ordering takeout for dinner, I handed her the cake she loves. But there was something off about Susan. "Susan, is something wrong?" As I handed her my suit jacket and asked, she gave a small nod. There was a solemn look on her face. As I sat down on the living room couch, Susan took a seat in front of me. Then, she said words that I couldn't believe. "I'm pregnant, and I want us to break up." The words hit me like a blunt force to the back of my head. I could never have imagined hearing such words from Susan. Susan and I don't have any kids. She was the one who had convinced me, who wanted a child right after we got married, that it was too soon. Respecting her wish to enjoy our newlywed life a little longer, I had promised to wait for her sake. We were careful these past 2 years. So, what's this new life in her belly? I want a divorce. It's for the child. I never wanted to hear the phrase "for the child" from Susan's mouth in such a situation. I thought it would be a phrase we'd use joyfully together as a couple. Susan was looking at me expressionlessly. But it seemed her intention to divorce was firm. "Please sign this. I want a divorce, for the sake of my child." Susan laid out divorce papers with her signature already on them before me. The witnesses section was signed by Susan's parents. She had already consulted her parents. I want to know who the father is. But I couldn't afford to lose my cool here. I have my pride, too. So, you're serious? In response to my question, Susan gave a firm nod. After that, I only remembered concentrating hard not to let the pen shake in my hand. She carefully folded the signed divorce papers, and it seemed she had already packed her things. A large suitcase in hand, she headed for the door, and I had no words for Susan, who was about to leave. Susan didn't look back at me again. Her feelings for me were gone. It was clear from her expression. She disappeared into the twilight, pulling her suitcase behind her. All I could do was gaze at Susan's retreating figure. That night, I drank alone until I fell asleep. Because I had passed out drunk in the living room, it seemed I had caught a cold. I was hit by a headache and chills, which are different from a hangover. I called my workplace. I told them I would be taking a sick day due to poor health. Reflecting on last night, I wondered if it was all a dream. But there were the liquor bottle and that pen on the living room table. It wasn't a dream. Susan really did betray me and left. When reality hit again, my chest throbbed with pain. And I realized the saying, the cuter they are, the harder they fall, is really true. I can't believe how much I hate Susan, who I loved so much. I have to find the other man. I spent a day rummaging through the belongings Susan left behind with that thought in mind. The ring and bracelet I gave her when we were dating were still in the jewelry case. I found the wedding ring in the trash can. What was Susan thinking when she threw the ring into the trash can? Just imagining that made me feel dizzy. I spent all day looking for clues about the other man, but in the end, I only succeeded in raising my fever. Despite all this, I kept rummaging through her belongings incessantly, feeling as if I'd fall apart if I didn't stay busy. But because I was in such a state, my health didn't fully recover in a day. In the end, I ended up taking a week off from work. Somehow, when I managed to get myself back to work, my coworkers knew about my divorce. Even though I hadn't told HR yet. How are you feeling, Ryan? You're such a softie, getting sick just because of a divorce. My direct boss, Tom Gary, strolled up to me with a smirk. Gary was always the type to nitpick and make life difficult for me. His overly pretentious demeanor, along with his sleazy behavior, were always off-putting. As I begrudgingly endured his company, I suddenly realized he mentioned the divorce. Then, it hit me. Before she got married to me, Susan and Gary used to work in the same department. Oh, didn't Susan tell you about the divorce, or was your tiny little pride too precious for that? He sneered, and the pieces fell into place. Are you the father of Susan's unborn child? I asked in a low, grating voice. Gary, in a jesting tone, confirmed, that's right. He was completely mocking me. For a moment, I didn't realize what I had done. When I came to, Gary was sprawled across the room, a toppled chair and scattered desk items around him. I felt a dull pain in my clenched fist. The ensuing chaos was like something out of a festival. Some people were helping Gary up, others were trying to restrain me. Gary, despite being hit, was laughing. He was laughing at the future trouble I had just invited. He had baited me into it. Gary is the grandson of the founder of our company. I had just punched a future company executive. Of course, I was suspended. And then, inevitably, I was fired. I became an unemployed man, dumped by his wife. My life after that was a wreck. I knew I needed to look for a job to survive. But my actions couldn't catch up with my thoughts. I started drinking during the day, and as night fell, I would start drinking all over again. I suppose this is what they call self-destructive. I had no motivation to do anything. My only consolation was that I had savings. I wanted to thank the old me for being diligent in saving money. While living such days, after about a month, a surprising visitor arrived. At first, I pretended I wasn't home. But 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. Once again, I pretended not to be home. The doorbell rang again an hour later. Annoyed, I wondered who on earth could be bothering me. As I reluctantly opened the front door, I found an unfamiliar woman standing there. She stood tall, gazing at me with a piercing stare. I felt like I was being judged, and I quickly averted my eyes. May I ask your name?" I asked. The woman staring at me had a dignified appearance and a face that suggested a strong will. Suddenly, I felt embarrassed about the alcohol on my breath. I hadn't even bothered to shave. "Are you the ex-husband of that woman?" she asked abruptly, nearly stopping my heart. She didn't beat around the bush. She was Gary's wife. And that woman she mentioned must have been Susan. Well, I stuttered, at a loss for words. The woman deeply bowed her head. She introduced herself as Lillian Gary. Just as I'd imagined, she was Gary's wife. The neighborhood ladies passed by, shooting me curious glances. I always found these gossip-loving folks a bit hard to deal with. "Please, come inside." I hastily invited Lillian in, trying to avoid the gossip that would inevitably spread otherwise. "Thank you," she replied, and walked into the house without hesitation. Of course, I hadn't done any cleaning at all. As I led her into the chaotic living room, she began to silently gather the trash scattered around. "I can clean that up myself," I tried to insist, but she cut me off. "We can't have a serious conversation in this mess, can we? If you're not going to help, please sit down." She snapped, so I sat up straight. I sat down on the couch and watched in stunned silence as she went about tidying up. "Why don't you go wash your face?" she suggested. I got startled by her words, and I dashed off to the bathroom. I washed my face quickly. I was shocked at the sight of myself in the mirror, as I looked like a stranger. I washed my face and shaved. I washed and combed my hair. For the first time in a long time, I felt a little bit more like a human. When I returned to the living room, the cleaning was already finished. The trash had been bagged up and set out in the hallway. "I used your kitchen," Lillian said as she offered me a cup of tea. She seemed quite reliable for Gary's wife. "Thank you, I feel like a human again." I was surprised by how naturally my gratitude spilled out. Lillian gave me a faint smile in response to my words. But in the next moment, her smile disappeared. "My husband asked me for a divorce. He said it's because he has a child now." She cut straight to the chase. It seemed she disliked beating around the bush. "I was told the same thing by my wife. I'm already divorced." When I told her it was none of my business anymore, she let out a deep sigh. It seemed that the affairs of her husband, Gary, weren't a new occurrence. Apparently, he had resolved a previous scandal with money, and it was also with Susan. Susan took the payoff, and she immediately married me. She told me she had married as proof of ending her relationship with Gary. He had attempted to resolve it with money this time as well, but Susan wasn't budging. From Lillian's tone, I could tell she still loved Gary. She wanted to somehow get rid of Susan. "So, I get what you want to say, but you want to mend things with Gary and not get her divorce." This man had cheated on her twice with the same woman and even had a child with her. Could she still be holding on to feelings for him? When asked if she didn't want a divorce, Lillian looked a little surprised. She had an expression as if divorce hadn't even crossed her mind. Do you really think you can start over from this point? Even I think it's a bit mean to ask. But I found her expressions and attitude intriguing. I wanted to know what Lillian's response would be. With a small smile, she simply said, "We're married, after all." I don't know why, but I felt defeated. In the end, I asked Lillian to leave that day, agreeing to discuss it again another time. The day after Lillian's visit, Gary came over. It seemed he had heard from Lillian about her meeting with me yesterday. As a former boss, I decided to invite him into the living room. Gary looked around the living room and then laughed. "Find something funny. This, Lillian cleaned up, didn't she?" Gary said this with amusement in his voice. I hadn't noticed, but it seemed that Lillian's style was reflected in how she tidied up. Feeling the vibe of understanding between them irritated me. When I asked him what brought him here, Gary said he had a request for me. He wanted me to convince Lillian to divorce him, the request that left me shocked. According to Gary, Lillian can't have children. He loves children and needs an heir. The fact that Susan is pregnant was a golden opportunity. He offered me a reward for convincing Lillian to agree to a divorce and placed a thick envelope in front of me. The sight of him trying to solve everything with money made me sick. I want kids, and that's something Lillian can't give me. At these words, I lost my patience. I grabbed him by the collar, but Gary was still laughing. He probably thought he wouldn't get punched twice. Just as I was about to swing my fist, a soft hand gently grasped my raised fist. "Is my husband worth punching?" Lillian said she had followed Gary. "You left the front door wide open. That's careless." As she scolded me, I involuntarily lowered my fist, and I muttered okay. My grip on Gary's collar loosens, momentum extinguished. "So you want a child, huh?" Lillian murmurs as she looked at Gary. As he nods, she pulls out some documents from her bag. They were divorce papers. "Are you satisfied now?" Lillian smiled as she offered the papers to Gary. Her smile was stunningly beautiful, almost eerie. It looked as if it could forgive anything and everything, yet at the same time, it was as if it could send someone straight to hell. As Gary takes the divorce papers, his fingers lightly trace over the back of her hand. It felt like I've seen something I shouldn't have, and I quickly averted my eyes. "Thank you." Gary leaves these words behind, swiftly striding towards the front door. "We're enemies now, aren't we, Gary? Better be ready." Gary waved without turning around to her words. It seemed that he had accepted her declaration of war. Once Gary was out of sight, Lillian turned back to me. "Shall we lick our wounds together? But first, let's have our revenge." We both separately demanded compensation from Gary and Susan. They're well off. No matter how much we demand, they're likely to pay. I asked my lawyer to proceed with all matters simultaneously, because I wanted them to suffer, even if just a little. This would be just a bit of payback, child's play, really. After demanding the compensation, Susan finally came crying. It seems Gary will pay his own part, but he won't pay Susan's portion. They're not married yet, so it's only natural, but it seems there's more to it. At a meeting between the four of us, Gary started saying that I was also to blame for Susan's affair. He claimed it was a result of making her feel lonely due to my constant work. "You sure have a knack for blowing smoke, don't you? It won't work on me." What Lillian pulled out was a report on Gary's personal investigation. The investigation had apparently been requested by Gary's parents. Susan and Gary had been involved before my marriage to her, and at one point, Susan had accepted a settlement to sever ties. However, behind the scenes, the relationship continued. Apparently, my marriage to her was suggested by Gary as a camouflage. I love my work and I'm a bit insensitive. For them, having an insensitive husband was very convenient. Moreover, since I was working with Gary, they could always keep an eye on me. The report Gary's parents had put together by spending a considerable amount of money was unbelievably detailed. Lillian reads through the contents in a steady voice. The color drains from Gary and Susan's faces. The first to break was Susan. She starts to scream amidst her tears. Stop it now. It's not good for the baby if you stress yourself out so much. At our reprimand, Susan flinched. Being stared down by Lillian's icy eyes, Susan fainted on the spot. Gary, panicking, cradled Susan in his arms, to which Lillian smiled. Already surrendering. That's a shame. I believe Lillian truly loved Gary. Love and hate are two sides of the same coin. The deeper the love, the deeper the hate. It seemed Gary understood that too. In the end, I had no role in the discussion, and the meeting ended with Lillian dominating the conversation. At the end, Lillian laughed at me, saying, "That's it." Afterwards, the reason for my divorce became well known at work. I was the one who had leaked it to my coworkers. The company wanted to cover it up, but it was too late. In the end, Gary was sidelined at work and had no place in his family. After remarrying, Susan is struggling with in-law issues. It seems that Gary's parents, who liked Lillian, are harshly treating Susan, who took Lillian's place after driving her out. I think it serves her right. When everything about the alimony and other issues had been settled, I invited Lillian for a coffee. She told me about her current situation, working at a friend's company while living alone. I can't have children, so I need to be self-sufficient. I don't feel the same fear I did back then when I see Lillian speaking with such a sincere expression. Your reason for being independent seems a bit off. I disagreed with Lillian. She looked at me, surprised. It was the first time I had strongly insisted on something. I noticed she was still wearing her wedding ring. It was proof she hadn't forgotten Gary. Summoning my courage, I decided to give her the words I had been practicing since last night. I don't mind that. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. I took a deep breath. Then I asked her to wait until I found a job, as I was applying to be Lillian's boyfriend. Lillian and I will definitely work out. We understand each other's pain. I will never hurt you. From my expression, she seemed to understand that I wasn't joking. She looked down once and then chuckled. I'm quite a handful, you know. I am well aware of that, I replied. I gently traced the back of her hand with my finger. It seemed like she was recalling something as she squinted her eyes. She gently brushed off my finger and then took off her ring. I felt it was her way of breaking away from her past. Then, she lightly touched my hand. Her delicate fingers traced the back of my hand. It felt like her love was flowing into me from her fingertips. I'll make you happy, so please wait. Lillian laughs as if she's bursting with joy. I swore in my heart to always protect that smile. What did you think? Subscribing to the channel will encourage us to produce more. See you in the next video.
My name is Jake Harrison. I'm just an average office worker in my 30s, toiling away in the daily grind of commuting between home and work. Aging and getting tired seems inevitable, but one of the main causes of my fatigue is the influence of my boss, Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson is competent, beautiful, and looked like a model. On top of that, she is an elite who's been promoted early due to her excellent performance. She's so perfect, people often joke that God must have mistakenly packed all the talent into one person when he created her. However, for some reason, she's tough on me. Jake, there was another error in your paperwork, wasn't there? I'm sorry. I'm not looking for an apology. I want to know why you made a mistake. Listen carefully to what people say, because I often make mistakes. I frequently get scolded by Mrs. Wilson like this. That kind of thing put extra pressure on me to avoid making mistakes, and as a result, I'm exhausted. Hugh, it's always so relaxing here. While saying so, I take a seat on a bench in a park. The park is close to my office, but there are not many people because there are homeless people. That's why I often take breaks here. It's my hidden retreat. Well, let's see how much I can get done today. After finishing my sandwich quickly, I took out some yarn from my bag. People might say it's feminine, but I've always enjoyed crafting. That's why I'm silently knitting here as a way to relieve stress. There's another reason I choose to knit here. Back again today, Jake. Hello, Joe. When I'm knitting, an old homeless man comes to sit next to me. This man is Joe. He's a friendly guy, a good conversation partner for me. People tend to shun him because he's homeless, but Joe doesn't mock me for knitting or call me feminine. He always listens to my stories. I started talking with Joe like this a few months ago. Actually, at that time, I was dumped by my girlfriend I wanted to marry. We had been together for 3 years, but one day she suddenly disappeared, calling me effeminate and disgusting. She had moved out, left me, and that made me so desperate. Even though we dated for 3 years, the way she dumped me was unbelievable. The woolen hat I knitted for her. In the end, I couldn't give it to her. Honestly, I thought about throwing it away. That's when Joe started talking to me. Are you really going to throw that away? Yeah, but would you like to use it? I plan to give it to my girlfriend, but I don't need it anymore. I must have had a devastated look on my face at that time. Joe listened to me compassionately. This encounter became the starting point, and Joe and I began to chat frequently in this park. He still treasures the hat I gave him at that time. He's a truly kind person. You seem even more passionate today. Yeah, you know what? I made a mistake again today. During the brief lunch break, talking to this old homeless man is my way of relaxing. Joe listens to my stories with interest, and I enjoy our time. But the fun time always ends quickly. Well, I'll be back. Don't make a mistake next time. As I packed up my knitting and handed Joe some snacks I had bought for him, I left the place. A few weeks later, I was assigned to go on an outside job with Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson is very efficient at her work and very popular with our clients. Honestly, I wonder if I'm really needed, but it seems like the reason is the luggage is heavy, so help me. I can't help it because my sales skills are lacking, but I was knitting in the park today, hoping that she would rely on me a bit more. Hello, Jake. Joe, hello. Sorry, I might not be able to stay long today. I have an outside job after lunch. That must be Duff. As usual, he said to me in a relaxed tone. When I talk to him, I feel tension leave my shoulders, and I can relax. He may have once had a job where he had to talk to people. As I was thinking that, my phone rang suddenly. It was Mrs. Wilson. Jake, where are you right now? I'm at Cozy Park. That's perfect. Just decided to use my car for today's field job, so I'll pick you up. After Mrs. Wilson said that, I checked my watch. Indeed, lunch break was almost over. The timing was perfect. I was called by my boss, so I'll leave soon. Is it the scary boss you were talking? Don't say that in front of her. I saw Mrs. Wilson car stop at the entrance of the park. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, for picking me up. It's on the way, so it doesn't matter. I didn't know there was a park here. Mrs. Wilson stared at me in the park and froze. To be precise, she was looking at Joe, who was behind me. D-Dad? Mrs. Wilson ran up to Joe and hugged him. I've been looking for you. I was so worried. Jake, Who is this beautiful person? Huh? Looking at the clueless Joe, Mrs. Wilson was frozen. I told Mrs. Wilson that he has amnesia. Knowing the fact, Mrs. Wilson seemed to be shocked. No way. Dad, did you forget about me? Are you sure you're not mistaken? I can't believe I have such a beautiful daughter. You're not mistaken, because those gloves, they were made by Mom. Saying that, Mrs. Wilson was teary-eyed. Come to think of it, Joe always wore those ragged gloves. Even though they were worn out with holes and missing fingers, it was something he had worn since he came here. He seemed to cherish them. Mrs. Wilson asked Joe several times, but Joe just tilted his head. It wasn't getting anywhere like this, so I decided to leave the park with Mrs. Wilson for now. It was time for work after all. During the field job, we were silent all the way. Mrs. Wilson, who never put personal feelings into her work, is strict but handled things professionally until the work was over. But as soon as the field job ended and we arrived at the parking lot, she burst into tears, perhaps unable to hold it in any longer. All alone, she muttered softly, "Dad, was it so traumatic that you forgot? She looked so pitiful." Mrs. Wilson, if you're okay with it, I'll listen to you. I said this more as a consolation, but it seemed Mrs. Wilson had wanted someone to listen, and she slowly began to talk about Joe. No, about her father, Mr. John Wilson. The Wilson family was a bit wealthier than the average family. Mr. John was a school teacher, and his wife was a nurse. However, when Mrs. Wilson was just starting her career, her mother passed away suddenly. She was involved in a traffic accident, it seemed. Dad loved Mom so much. After she passed away, he quit his job and secluded himself all the time. At the time, Mrs. Wilson, who had already moved out of the house, would check on her father in between work. But as it got busy, she couldn't go home often and couldn't get through on the phone. When a worried Mrs. Wilson finally returned home after a long while, Mr. John was gone. I filed a missing persons report, but he couldn't be found. If I had been by his side, this wouldn't have happened. It seemed like Mrs. Wilson had been blaming herself for her father's disappearance until now, and she cried sorrowfully. Seeing that also hurt me, and I wanted to bring Joe home. But Joe didn't react very well to Mrs. Wilson, and even if I took him home in his current condition, he would likely return to the park. Including getting him examined at a hospital, the hurdles are quite high. Dad, if we return home, will he remember something? Even if he doesn't remember, at least I want to take him to the hospital. Mrs. Wilson, as a daughter worrying about her father. I thought, and then came up with a good idea. Hey, Mrs. Wilson, let's knit. Knit. Joe. Mr. John is a really kind person. The reason I first became friends with him is because he spoke to me when he saw me knitting. He also cherished his gloves, so if you give him a gift, he might be interested and listen to you. Joe always seemed to have an interest in knitting. Then Mrs. Wilson also said optimistically, my mom used to knit a lot. He might vaguely remember that. However, she looked down a bit. But I've never knitted before. It's okay. I'll teach you. Jake, thank you. I'm sorry you had to see me like this. Mrs. Wilson smiled weakly. She seemed a little worried, but it seemed like she wanted to do something for her father. Looking straight at me, she asked, could you teach me how to knit again? Yes, of course. And so I found myself teaching Mrs. Wilson to knit. However, there are only a few places where Mrs. Wilson and I can practice together. We can't go to her house, so we decided to knit in the car. Could you take that thread? Like this? Yes. Now put it through that loop. Oh, it's not going in well. Should I push it further in? Well, no, don't pull the yarn like that. But things weren't going smoothly. I think we had this kind of conversation about 5 times. Mrs. Wilson is very capable at work, but turns out she's actually incredibly clumsy. When the idea of knitting came up, it made sense that she might look down. I honestly thought it would be a long haul, but that's our elite boss, Mrs. Wilson. Apparently, she practiced at home, and before we knew it, she was getting the hang of it. She was using the most basic stitch, and it was pretty rough, but still, she kept at it for several months. Somehow, Mrs. Wilson finished knitting a scarf. Finally done. let's go deliver it. But what if he doesn't accept it? He's not that kind of person. Come on. I wanted to show Joe the scarf that Mrs. Wilson worked so hard to make, so I took her hand and headed to the park. I used to come to the park quite often, but this was Mrs. Wilson's first time since that day. When Joe saw us, he said in his usual calm voice, "Oh, isn't it Jake? You're not alone today." "Go ahead, Mrs. Wilson." "I know." With a bit of nervousness, Mrs. Wilson looked straight at Joe and offered him the scarf. "Dad, it honestly makes me so sad that you've forgotten me. But I was so relieved to know you're alive. I won't even ask you to come back to home, but I don't want you to catch a cold. I made this in the same color as the scarf my mom used to wear often. It's not as good as hers, but I'd like you to accept it." While telling her heartfelt feelings as a daughter, Mrs. Wilson gives the scarf towards him with a smile. Mrs. Wilson's mother was good at knitting, and this time Mrs. Wilson had made a scarf with a design similar to the one her mother often wore while she was alive. It was filled with Mrs. Wilson hoped that it might jog his memory a bit. Joe accepted the scarf and said, "It's warm. I wonder why. I feel so warm here, just looking at your smile. I wonder why. I'm in tears." Joe said that as he wrapped the scarf around his neck, touching his chest and shedding a single tear. I wasn't expecting his memory to miraculously return just because of a scarf, but it seemed to have kind of triggered it. After that, he started going to the hospital with Mrs. Wilson, my boss. We're not sure if his memory will ever fully return, but it's said to promote Joe's health and social recovery. He didn't want to be hospitalized, but recently Joe has stopped going to the park and has started to return to Wilson's family home. Perhaps it's because of these positive progress that Joe has started to occasionally remember his own name, which made both Wilson and me happy. By the way, he still has the scarf I gave him, and he wears it alternately every day. Thank you, Jake. It's all thanks to you. And so, I returned to my usual routine of knitting in the park. On that day, Wilson came and sat next to me. Wilson stands out in a good way at the office, so I appreciate being able to talk with her in the park. I'm grateful, but ever since that knitting, Wilson has been acting much more casual with me. I guess we've gotten close, but to me, Wilson is too attractive, and it makes my heart race. What am I doing at my age? I feel so pathetic. You're the one who put all the effort into knitting, Mrs. Wilson. I didn't really do much. Teaching me to knit wasn't a big deal to you? Well, haha. I gave her a smile as I stuffed my mouth with a sandwich. Through our interactions, I've come to understand that Wilson tends to be stern with those she has high expectations of at work. She had high expectations of me too, which is why she apologized for being so strict. So, Jake, would you like to have dinner with me sometime? To thank you also. Really? I was taken aback by her unexpected suggestion, but Wilson laughed and said, "Of course, or you don't want to have dinner with me? I'll go. I would be honored." I jumped at the chance, which made Wilson laugh again. "You're honest. Can we exchange our contact?" "Yes, I just realized I don't know your contact, Mrs. Wilson." "Call me Sophia. Register me as that, Jake Harrison." "What?" I froze at hearing my full name, but Wilson just input my contact and then casually said, "I'll contact you later," and left. Wilson, she knew my full name all along. It makes me happy and can't help but grin. I'll try my best to get her trust enough for her to call me by my name. While making such determination, I start knitting. A scarf woven in shades of blue and white is what I'm planning to make. I hope to finish it before the dinner with Sophia. And then, I will tell her what I feel. "I love you. Will you be my girlfriend?" I knew it. You took forever to say it. When I finally gathered the courage to confess my feelings over dinner, she happily said so. I wondered if I had been such an open book, but if she got the message, that's all that matters. So we officially became a couple, progressing steadily in our relationship, and eventually we decided to get married. By the way, we haven't had our wedding ceremony yet. Actually, when I proposed to her after a year of dating, I asked Sophia when the marriage registration was supposed to be done. I was thinking we should do it on a special date, but Sophia seemed to have different plans. You do realize I'm over 30, right? Yeah, I know. Don't keep a woman waiting forever. I want to get married right away. Otherwise, I'm afraid someone else might snatch you away from me. What a cute thing to say, so we submitted the marriage registration before the ceremony. So now, although Sophia and I are married, I'm still doing my knitting at the same park. I want to wear a stole you made at our wedding. When you hear something like that, it motivates you, doesn't it? Plus, Joe is planning to come to the wedding. He hasn't remembered everything yet, but he's slowly recalling bits and pieces of his past. I thought our wedding might serve as some kind of trigger, but he seemed unsure, asking, am I even supposed to be there, with an anxious look on his face. So to ease Joe's worries, I'm planning to gift him something I've knitted too. According to him, the things we've knitted have been like good luck charms to him and have been really reassuring. What color should I go for? Imagining my future bride, I pick up my yarn again today.